Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, I'm your host, and today's chapter is Genesis 5. Let's read the text together as we start. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe or follow button on your podcast player so we can study together again in the future. Today's study is probably going to be a little bit shorter than some of the ones we've had previously and some of the ones after it, and you'll see why because of the subject matter that we're going to read about here in a second. So let's read the text of Genesis 5 together now. This is the book of the generation of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them, and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 850 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and called his name Noah, saying, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands." Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So today's chapter is rather repetitive, as you may have noticed. Maybe you read the text for yourself ahead of time and already knew about that. But we'll talk about what exactly this is, what the purpose of it is. We've discussed it a little bit in the previous chapter. This is a genealogy, but we'll talk about why it's important and what we can learn from it, because there are things that are actually really, really important, and there's reasons that this is in the Bible for us and as a record to ancient people and modern people. So we turn now to our outline, or our PDF, which you can download on our website at tobelikechrist.com for free, or you can just get it all out of the way, get all the outlines all at once. If you would like to in a hard copy, you can buy a book on Amazon. There's links to both of those things down in the description. And as we always do, we try to answer our key questions before outlining the chapter and then taking an application from it. So let's talk about our when, our characters, and our where. Let's start with when. The historical figures that are mentioned in chapter 5 lived between the creation of the world and the global flood. Now, we haven't talked about the global flood yet. We're going to talk about that in chapter 6 through 9. So hold on till tomorrow. This period of history is sometimes you'll hear it called the antediluvian age, which just means the pre-flood age. And then the post-diluvian phase is after the flood, right? You may just hear those terms thrown around, or honestly, they're not terms that you really need to know. But we're talking pre-flood at this point. On our Bible timeline, between chapters 4 and chapter 6, we're covering about 1,650 years. To put that in maybe an easier to understand perspective as to just how much time that is. So in the modern day, it's about 2025, and 1,650 years ago would be roughly like the 300s, 375? Is that right? My math. Hold on, let me pull out the handy dandy calculator here. 2025 minus 1650. Ooh, I got it right. 375 AD. Think about how much time has been since 375 AD and how many things have happened. You've got the Middle Ages in there. You've got the beginnings of Islam. You've got the beginnings of, the end of the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance period, all that. There's so much stuff. There's so many nations rising and falling in that period of time. That's a huge amount of time. And it's important to know for our comprehension of the Bible that Genesis 4 through Genesis 6 covers that much time. On the surface, it's not as obvious. And so it's important to point out and just to recognize, there's a massive amount of time between Adam and Eve and the flood that we're going to talk about in chapters 6 through 9, even though it's crunched into this really tiny section of the Bible. And yes, I'm with you. I would like to know more information about what happened before the flood and all that was going on and what the earth was like, but we just aren't given any information. This is not the priority of God in writing the Bible, is to give us all those curiosities. He's writing about the redemption of mankind, how they're going to be saved from that problem that was introduced in Genesis chapter 3, the sin problem. Now, for our character section, we have a bunch of names in here, and obviously we're not going to write them all down and highlight all of them, but I'll just point out a couple key ones, and we'll point these out as we go throughout the outline, so we won't spend a whole lot of time here today. We start, obviously, with Adam and Eve, who are the first man and the first woman. And this is a genealogy of the sons of Seth. So Seth was one of their children. They had Cain, they had Abel, but Abel was killed by his brother Cain. And then Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. And so this family tree, this record, is Seth's line. Okay, so keep that in mind. That can be a little bit confusing, because some of the names actually overlap Cain's line, or don't overlap them, but they're the same as the names that appear in Cain's line. You have Lamech, who's one. You have Enoch, who is another one. But these aren't the same people. Those were sons in chapter 4. Those were sons of Cain. These are the sons of Seth. So that can be a little bit confusing. But I don't know if they just weren't really that creative even in the beginning with their naming. But if you have the same name and has a bunch of other people in your town, know that that's been going on since the beginning of the world. So you have a Methuselah in this chapter, but you have a Methushael in the last chapter. So that's pretty close. Anyway, we have Adam and Eve. We have this guy named Methuselah, who is, you may have noticed, he lives 969 years, which is the oldest in that group. And he is the oldest person who we have record of in the Bible. Sometimes you'll say he was the oldest person to ever live. Maybe. He's the oldest person that we have record of. Somebody might have outlived him. Somebody might have made it to 1,000 years. We don't know. But he is the oldest recorded human being in the scriptures, 969 years. And then we have Noah. And Noah is right at the end of this chapter. He's going to be the main character of chapters 6 through 10. So keep him in mind. He's going to build an ark, which is going to allow a small portion of mankind to survive this worldwide flood that we're going to be talking about. More on that in the upcoming days. And then we go to our where section, our geography section, and we don't have a lot here. Genesis 5, as I mentioned, is a record of the names of Adam and Eve's descendants through their son Seth. The author doesn't give us specifics about where these men and their families lived. So it's still kind of a mystery as to where exactly all these things played out on the earth and what the earth looked like at that time. So again, not God's priority to fill us in on all of those details. So let's now go into our outline section, break the chapter down, make sure we understand what we're reading, and we'll highlight a few of these individuals who we've been talking about in this chapter so that they're a little bit more than just names. They actually can associate some things with them. In the first section of my outline, I just have the purpose of Genesis 5. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in our application section, so we'll be brief here. As I mentioned, Genesis 5 is a genealogy or a family tree. Webster's dictionary defines genealogy as an account of the descent of a person, family, or group from an ancestor. In this case, the ancestor is Adam and his wife Eve. This particular genealogy tracks Seth's line. It does not go through Cain, who is their oldest son, so just keep that in mind. Why Seth? As we mentioned in the previous chapter, Seth is kind of the most important line to track because ultimately we're going to find out that Jesus comes through the line of Seth. And when you open up the New Testament and you read about the Gospels like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that tell us about Jesus' life, there are genealogies in the beginning of the Gospels, and they give this line all the way from Adam through Seth all the way up to Jesus. You see that in Luke's gospel. And so this is all one connected story. And these aren't just a bunch of random stories about random people that the Bible's tossing together. It can seem that way sometimes. It can get a little bit confusing as to how certain stories relate to this overall picture of how God is saving the world. But just trust the process. The more you read about the Bible, the more you study it, the more of these connections you begin to see. This brings us to our summary, basically, of this genealogical record. And this is pretty dry stuff. We just have a bunch of names and a bunch of death dates and how old particular individuals were when they gave birth to their children. This is verses 1 through 32, the genealogy of Adam through Seth. But we'll try to make this interesting. So our first individuals to highlight here, Adam fathered Seth when he was 130 years old, and he died at the age of 930. So we talked about these human beings living very long lives. That could have been just because God allowed it to happen so the earth could become populated. It could have been due to environmental factors. The world could have been significantly different before the flood. And we talked about how some people scoff at that and make fun of it, but if you have a God who's capable of creating the complex universe that we live in, that's not a problem. He can keep a human being alive for 2,000 years if he really wants to. So he permitted people to live longer before the flood. What we're going to see after the flood, though, is a steep decrease in lifespan. Adam fathers Seth. Adam dies at the age of 930. Seth fathers Enosh, and Seth dies at 912. Enosh fathers Kenan when he's 90 years old, and then he eventually dies at 905. Kenan fathers Mahalalel when he's 70, and he dies at the age of 910. Mahalalel fathers Jared when he was 65 years old, and he dies at 895. Jared fathers Enoch, and Enoch is really maybe the first one who we want to pull out here and highlight a little bit. Enoch is one of only two people that we know about that didn't die physically. The text tells us that Enoch was a man who walked with God. Seems like he had a very close relationship with God. He was a godly man. And it says that God took him. That's all the information that we have. That God took him when he was 365 years old. So he doesn't die. He just apparently goes directly to be with the Lord in heaven. You get bonus points if you know who the other man in the Bible was who never died and who God took directly to be with him. I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. It starts with an E. He had a student who had a very similar name to him. His student's name was Elisha. The one who didn't die was Elijah. You may remember or have heard about the story of Elijah being taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. So those two, as far as I know, are the only two individuals who never died. So that's Enoch. Jared was his father, and Jared died at the age of 962. Now, Enoch fathers Methuselah when he's 65, and as we mentioned, Methuselah lives 969 years, and as far as we know, He is the oldest person to ever live on the earth. One thing to remember is that Enoch is not the same Enoch that is mentioned in chapter 4, and now Methuselah has a son named Lamech, who is not the same Lamech who is mentioned in chapter 4. We discussed Lamech in chapter 4. He was a descendant of Cain's, Seth's brother, and he was the guy who killed a man and also took 2 wives. That's specifically told to us in the text. But this is not the same Lamech as far as I can tell. This is Seth's descendant. So, got to keep those straight. Lamech is not known for killing people and taking 2 wives, but rather being the father of Noah. And Noah gets some special attention in chapter 5, as he will in chapters 6 through 10. But let's read this prophecy that's made over Noah when he's born. Verse 28 reads, "When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, 'Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands.'" So from Noah's birth, there's this prophecy that he's going to be quite significant, and he is going to be very significant in that through him, God is going to save the human race. When so many of the people around him were terribly wicked, when the earth was full of evil and full of violence, as we're going to learn, Noah is faithful to God, and because of that, God selects him to be the human who survives the flood, and his family also is going to be able to come with him. That he's going to be essentially the seed to restart the human race after the wicked human race gets wiped out by God in judgment. So, again, more on that in the upcoming days. The final part of this chapter tells us that Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are his 3 sons. They're going to be on the ark with him. He fathers them quite late in life in comparison to some of the other individuals we've read about. They were fathered when he was 500 years old. So that is our breakdown of chapter 5. I hope I made that as interesting as I could. It's definitely not the easiest chapter to keep people's attention, but that's Genesis chapter 5, and that's the line of Seth through Noah. Let's finish up today with an application. What on earth can we take away from a giant list of names and ages? Well, as I mentioned, these actually have a very significant place in understanding the Bible and connecting the stories all the way back here in Genesis to the stories all the way in the New Testament. You may read this list of names and think that it holds no value, but there's a reason this stuff is in the Bible. Throughout the Bible, God made several important promises pertaining to specific families and their future children, their descendants. If you know anything about the Bible, maybe you know the names of Abraham or the name David. Well, they're some of those individuals whom God makes promises to them, and the promises pertain to their descendants. So Abraham's descendants are going to be a blessing to the entire world. David's descendants are going to reign on the throne of Israel forever. And all of these promises come to fruition and are fulfilled in Christ. And there's other promises as well that are fulfilled in other ways, but the ones that we really focus on are the ones that are accomplished in Jesus when he comes to the earth. Having a record of the ancient family lines allows us to see how God kept his promises across the generations. These genealogies are records of fathers and sons, but more than that, they are records of God's faithfulness. They are evidence to us that God is trustworthy and he never breaks his promises. So while you may not appreciate them now as you're just picking up the Bible and you're reading just the book of Genesis, when we start to read the other books of the Bible, then we'll begin to appreciate them more. And I also mentioned in the last podcast that these allow us to date the early earth. And without these lists of genealogies, that may be impossible. I'm not aware of any other way that we have to figure out just how much time we're talking about and how much time there was between the creation, or at least Genesis 4, and the flood, other than these genealogies. So there's a timeline, historical benefit to these, and maybe even to a greater degree, they are the evidence of God's faithfulness in keeping his promises across thousands and thousands of years. So that's our podcast for today. Thanks for joining in for a genealogy chapter in Genesis 5. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow, talk about Genesis 6, and we'll get this really interesting flood story going and talk about all that is wrapped up in that.